This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Neil Shubin, who is Provost of the Field Museum, as well as Robert R. Bensley, Professor of Organismal Biology and Anatomy at the University of Chicago, where he serves as Associate Dean. He's the author of the book, Your Inner Fish, A Journey into the 3.5 billion year history of the human body. He's visiting the Berkeley campus as the Hitchcock Professor in the spring of 2009. Neil, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Philadelphia.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world, the universe, I should say?
Yeah, my folks encouraged curiosity, and that was the biggest thing in me. I was the sort of kid who had a new hobby every week. I would want a telescope one week, a rock hammer the next week. It was always science. And they encouraged me exploring in a lot of ways. And I think that I can trace so much of my interest in science and ultimately the way I do science to the way my parents encouraged my curiosity.
And I assume that they were very supportive generally, basically, yeah?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we always did was go to museums. And, you know, it was just our form of recreation, museums, aquaria, things like that. And I just remember, you know, looking at museum exhibits or seeing fish in the aquarium, and it would just capture my imagination as a young kid, you know, and it still does in some ways.
And what about high school? Any teachers before you were off to college?
Yeah, I had some really excellent teachers in high school. I was really fortunate that way. What happened is actually being in Philadelphia, in 1976, I was about 10th or 11th grade, something like that. And that was the bicentennial celebrations, and it was a very big deal in Philadelphia. And I had a history teacher who wanted us to learn archaeology. And it was, and he was an amateur archaeologist himself, and he linked up with archaeologists. And we were working on archaeology of the colonial days. And it just blew my mind. You know, that we can, by digging in the dirt, learn something about our past, you know.
So in a way, you're sort of piecing things together that would prove useful later in life.
Oh, there's no doubt. Looking back, that was so critical, you know.
And undergraduate work?
Yeah, undergrad, so when I went to Columbia in New York City, which was fortuitous in a lot of ways, because there's the great museum in New York, the American Museum of Natural History, which was a venue that I hung out in all the time. I even had a little office when I was an undergrad there. There was a curator who basically set me up with an office. He saw I was a curious kid, set me up with an office, a library card, and keys to the collection. And he didn't ask anything of me other than just go explore. It was really remarkable what an opportunity that was. And but when I was at in college, I was interested in biology. That's where I really got interested in biology. I was started with an interest in archaeology, but then shifted to biology. And it soon became clear that if I wanted to bridge my interest in archaeology with my interest in biology, paleontology, not a bad way to go.
And is that what you majored in as an undergraduate?
No, I majored in anthropology, biology, and then I minored in geology. So there was no paleontology major. I sort of cut and pasted a lot of stuff.
And are you already seeing connections, or were connections being made between these disciplines as you took them as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student?
I see it in retrospect. At the time, I wasn't seeing it. But definitely in retrospect, I see how those connections were sitting probably in my subconscious in some way and influencing my behavior. Because I was also very interested in history as well. American history, classical history, and things like that. So all these different tendrils were sort of coming together in paleontology, evolutionary biology.
And then on to graduate school, and where did you do your graduate work?
In Boston at Harvard. And I entered Harvard wanting to work on fossil mammals and understand how mammals diversified. You know, why have some mammals that climb trees, others that dig, and so forth. And then by about the second year, switched to fish. for a lot of reasons. But fish and amphibians, because there are some fundamental problems I wanted to get at. And Harvard was another good choice because, like Berkeley actually, it's a big university that has a museum embedded inside of it. And so having, again, it's a linking from museum to the laboratory. That's always been something that I've done and sort of cherished actually. You know, a museum's always been important to me.
It's interesting because when you think of museums and libraries, you don't think of adventurers, which seems to be a part of your personality as we get into your work. Or is that not fair? Is that not a fair statement?
Well, it's right to think of them that way, but I think that's a miss. Yeah, it's because that's where the adventures begin. The adventures begin opening a cabinet in a museum, seeing some specimens, trying to figure out the problems that those specimens show you. It begins in a library where you're figuring out where to work in the field and so forth. So my starting point is always a library or a museum because they're revealing to me the problems, the puzzles, you know, that need solving.
And then at Harvard, what did you do your dissertation on?
I worked on the development and evolution of the limb, arms and legs, and I came up with a theory of the relationship between arms and legs and fins in fish. So sort of the transformation of fins to limbs, looking at embryology, how organisms develop, and looking at fossils. So I was trying to link my biology and paleontology interests.
So let's talk about what you are as a scientist. I guess you are both an anatomist and a paleontologist. And so let's go down that road. What are the skill sets that you think are required to do these fields well?
Well, there's the personal skill set, and then there's the scientific skills, intellectual skill set. I'll call it intellectual, really. The personal skill set is you have to be pretty patient. You have to be able to sort of sit with a problem long enough to find an answer. Curiosity helps, because that's what drives you. And that's the fuel, is curiosity, and it's always been. The intellectual skill set, I think, really is, you know, understanding the structure of the body, knowing the names of the holes and the bones and the bumps and the nerves and all that sort of stuff. Knowing quite a bit about genetics, that's sort of critical nowadays, how genes are inherited and how they specify pattern and anatomy and so forth. And basically, I think the other big piece of the skill set, and this is just sort of generic, is the willingness and lack of fear to enter new fields and to learn new disciplines. I mean, the way I look at my field is not as a separate silo, as one discipline. I really look at it as a puzzle or a problem to solve. And if you look at it as a puzzle or a problem to solve, different disciplines become tools to you. And so if you can somehow figure out how to gain access to those tools, even though they might be in another field like geology or chemistry or something like that, you will be better off at the end in your ability to solve your problem. So I think one of the most important things, particularly in today's science, is the ability and desire to collaborate or learn and extend one's toolkit to different disciplines.
You write in your book, you say the unknown should not be a source of suspicion, fear, or retreat to superstition, but motivation to continue asking questions and seeking answers.
Oh, yeah.
So you really have to be comfortable with moving across fields.
And taking a leap into the unknown.
Yeah.
You know, when you set off an experiment or a new expedition or something, there's no guarantee of success. You know, and there's a level of risk-taking that's in this as well. I mean, scientists are always taking risks, sometimes for quite bold ones. You know, and it is about, you know, finding answers to questions and then ultimately being able to ask better questions. You know, the questions don't stop; they just get better, hopefully, or more refined, hopefully. You know, if you're successful. You know, I was a child of Apollo, the rocket, not the Greek god. And you know, when I was fortunately, when I was 14, you know, 10 to 14, that's when the missions were going to the moon. You know, that blew my mind. That, you know, humanity can design a contraption that takes people to the moon and back, you know, and the ability to do that still chokes me up to this day. You know, it's remarkable.
And in this context, where do you see creativity? How would you characterize creativity? Is it something that flows from being on top of all of these disciplines and being comfortable with the tools that you just described?
I And creativity comes to us. I mean, it's hard to capture. I mean, I think for me, creativity comes at the moments when I'm able to throw off the constraints of some of my previous thinking, but not so much that I'm not throwing away to what I've learned. You know what I'm saying? It's sort of trying to see things in a new way that was sort of invisible to me before. Because of maybe mental traps I was in, or preconceived notions or expectations that I have. And the more I can get away from those, the more I can think in new ways and do something truly creative, you know. And so to me, it really comes down to trying to get rid of some of your preconceived notions and expectations and always challenging them. And we're not always good at that, but I think that's how advances happen.
Now, you had a fellowship at Berkeley, the Miller Fellowship, and I think you said yesterday in your lecture that this was a moment in your education that was very helpful in broadening your perspective and looking at these problems in the way that integrative biology does. Yeah,
very much. I mean, remember I said, you know, when I see the world as a set of problems, and different disciplines are tools to answer and help tackle those problems. When I dropped off in Berkeley as a Miller Fellow, you know, here I was in Berkeley with a bunch of people who looked at the world the same way. It was really remarkable. And so I fed off their sort of intellectual curiosity and energy and interdisciplinary approach to science and intellectual questions.
Now, you are doing your work at a time when there are really just many breakthroughs across fields, basically, and you talk about that. So it's an exciting time to be doing what you're doing because of the developments in genetics, the developments in information technology, and so on.
Oh, hugely so. You know, I'm asking questions or able to answer questions today that I wasn't even, you know, thinking about 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I mean, the pace of change is so rapid. Yet we're still, what's beautiful is to be able to apply new techniques, new approaches to sort of the classical problems, the questions that have been around for long periods of times that excited anatomists in the 1800s, to be able to address those fundamental questions. That's where the real thrill is, you know, and when you're able to do that, I mean, you can, I mean, it's just so satisfying. That's,
And in your book, you talk about your experiences lecturing medical students about human anatomy. So this is, I would presume that in a previous generation, were paleontologists teaching in medical school?
Yeah, from time to time they were. Yeah, it wasn't entirely unusual. I mean, in fact, because, you know, to be a paleontologist, you have to be a pretty good anatomist. And, you know, paleoanthropologists, it's routine for them to be involved in anatomy departments. You know, fish paleontologists like myself or amphibian ones, it's not as often. But it's not that much of a stretch. I remember, you know, when I started teaching human anatomy, the students would come to me and they'd say, you know, Dr. Shubin, what kind of doctor are you? You know, they'd say, are you a surgeon? Are you a cardiologist or something? I'd say, well, I'm a fish paleontologist now. Like, I want my money back.
A fish doctor, huh?
Yeah, right. He's like, I want my money back or something like that. But it became pretty clear as you begin to teach the course that being a paleontologist, an embryologist, a fish paleontologist in particular, actually offers a nice roadmap to the human body. So it became pretty powerful, actually.
And now you, in your work, you have made an important discovery, and this came, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because at some point you decided you were interested in these periods of revolution in the evolution of animals and man. Talk about that interest and where it came from.
Sure. If you look at the history of life, there are certain, you know, moments where it seems like revolution's in the air, where major changes are happening. You know, in the origin of body plans, or the origin of diverse kinds of fish, the origin of different kinds of, you know, creatures we call reptiles, you know, things like that. And, you know, seeing those periods helps me choose the intervals to work on as a paleontologist, you know, and so I work on Devonian age rocks, which are rocks about 365 to 380 or so million years old, that portion of the Devonian. And I do that because that's when a lot of groups of fish first came about, including fish with legs. And then also work in rocks about 200 million years old, because that's when different kinds of, you know, creatures we call reptiles came about, including mammals and crocodiles and dinosaurs and all kinds of different kinds of amphibians. So yeah, those have always attracted me, because when you run a field expedition in one of those intervals, there's always the chance of finding something that will tell you about one of these great transformations, these great transitions.
You quote Eisenhower in your book, who said, "In preparing for battle, I have found that planning is essential, but plans are useless."
Yeah, there's always, I mean, so take working in the Arctic, for example. I plan like crazy to work up there. With my colleague, Ted and Farish, who we planned together, we plan the expeditions down to the last candy bar. All the food goes up there and everything.
And you better bring them, I guess, because it's cold up there. Yeah. And the nearest town is not San Francisco.
Exactly. And that's your entertainment. So it's a good idea. Yet, I make all these plans, we do all this and have move days and plan when the helicopters are going to get there and so forth. But at some point you have to throw the plans away, because the facts on the ground change everything. You have to be flexible. The weather, mechanical may be bad, there may be mechanical problems. You may discover something in one place and want to stay there longer, or not be discovering something in a place you had high hopes for. So you have to retain a degree of flexibility as the facts on the ground change. And the only way you can be effective and be flexible is to have planned like crazy. I mean, you need that, sort of knowledge of all the parameters, and planning helps you do that. But you have to throw them away.
And you and I want to get the name right here. Your great breakthrough was the discovery of Tiktaalik, a large freshwater fish that had characteristics that told us that tell us it was a transitional figure in the movement from fish to land. Let's walk through that, and in being interested in these great periods of transformation, and you turn to geology first, and geology tells you a lot about where you want to look.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we work at home in libraries, or on the internet, to try to find places to go. And we have a time period in mind, and the biggest parameter to think about first is what age rocks you're going to work on. And that's really kind of what drove us to think about, finding Tiktaalik, was that when we look at what we knew about in the record of fish evolving features that allow their descendants to walk on land, it came out there's sort of a gap in our knowledge in rocks around 375 million years old. So that sort of insight was really critical. Then it became clear that we had to find rocks of the right type, places in the world that had rocks of the right type to find fossil fish. And then, and with that screen or that filter, we would look at geological maps, we would look at aerial photos, and then try to figure out where to go. And
even college textbooks.
Well, that's what I say. So I applied all these great things, and we were looking at geological maps and all this stuff, and had some ideas. But the ultimate insight that led to the discovery of Tiktaalik came from a college geology textbook, and it showed me an area and Ted Deschler, who I've been working with for years. It showed Ted and I an area we hadn't even considered before.
But in the beginning, with no budget, you had a comparable area, fortunately, in the state of Pennsylvania, where you were teaching.
Yeah, exactly.
So you could go down the road, so to speak.
Oh, literally, yeah. And spend $20 on a field expedition, driving from my car, and that was productive. But those rocks were sort of too young to produce a Tiktaalik-like creature. We were already finding limbed animals that were fairly far along.
Right.
And so we had to move back about 10 million years in time, and that's when the search for a new area began in about the mid-90s. And then we sort of ran into this college geology textbook during an argument, actually, in my office in Philadelphia. We ran into this undergraduate geology textbook and found that the Canadian Arctic had enormous amounts of exposed rock of just the right age.
Now, it's very clear that in your work, Serendipity is also at play, which we haven't mentioned yet. And when you chose the site for the kinds of formation of rocks which were accessible, and the rocks were from the period that you were interested in, you had an undergraduate assistant who began this discovery in a sense by being late, returning back to camp. But tell us about that.
Yeah, what happened was we had a college student who wanted to learn paleontology. His name was Jason Downs from the University of Pennsylvania at the time. He was a senior. And he came along with us. And Jason, so we all came, he somehow got separated from the team this day. And we all went back to prepare dinner, and it was around 7 o'clock, and there was no Jason. And that's a worry when someone gets separated and dinner rolls around and you're not seeing them. That's when you begin to worry if they're in trouble. Maybe they hurt themselves, sprain their ankle somewhere. The Arctic's a big place, and if they're hurt, it would be a challenge.
And you actually go out on your own, basically.
Well, we usually go out in groups of 2. That was the weird thing about this. I mean, you're not supposed to get separated, and Jason got separated.
I see.
So we were beginning to worry. And then we heard footsteps, coming into the tent. Tent opens up, and there's Jason. His eyes are like orbs, He's out of breath, and we're worried Jason's being chased by a polar bear or what have you. But the real reason became clear why he was so excited and late was every pocket of his parka and his pants was filled with fossil fish bones. What happened is during that absence, he had discovered a layer of rock that was contained like a carpet of fossil fish bones. So then, after talking to Jason, after he calmed down a bit and told us where the area was, we decided, it's the Arctic, it's daylight 24 hours a day. Dinner can wait. We grabbed the candy bars, and off we went to Jason's little site to look for the layer and try to map it. And it took us a while to find the layer. It took quite a while, actually. And then when we did, it turns out it was skeleton. That layer was produced that layer of fish bone fragments was produced by skeleton after skeleton of fossil fish, weathering out of the rocks. So it was really neat.
And the discovery was made on a subsequent trip. You went back
several years later, actually. It took nothing happened easier there. It took us about 6 years to find Tiktaalik. It took us a while to really hone in. Jason's site, we had to work it for 2 years before we found anything really important.
And was your fish found at that same site? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so what do you demarcate the site, and then does it remain secure during
you're in the middle
these?
of nowhere. Yeah, you're in the middle of nowhere, and nobody's going to find it. They'd have to really spend a ton of money and time to get to it. And it's also specialized. There's no fear of somebody working that site and finding. I mean, they'd have to know really some detailed geology. And I mean, I could take somebody to that site right now and show it to them, and they still wouldn't know where the layer is. You'd have to work there for a while to really get the nuance of what the rock and what the difference between rock and fossil is, and so forth.
And so the discovery is made in the sense that, hey, this is a place to look over time.
Right.
And then on the return trips, you're carefully digging in to go down.
Yeah, so we're exposing it as a big platform.
Yeah.
A flat bed, if you will. And on that bed were skeletons, some partial, some complete, some on top of one another, some mushed against each other. And as we did it, we weren't finding anything, truly important. I mean, they're interesting. They're telling us something about the ecosystem, but it took us a while. It was a lot of frustration, and part of it, part of the serendipity taking over here is being persistent enough to let that happen.
I see, right.
And we made the conscious decision to stick on this site for a long period of time, several years. In fact, the year we ended up finding Tiktaalik, which was 2004, I remember a conversation 3 months before we went into the field with Ted and Farish. We really started asking the question, do we really want to go this year? I mean, have we done it enough? And we all decided, no, one more go, and that's.
Now, what you're finding on the top, is it different kinds of fishes or pieces that you can't make anything out of it? And as you go down, are you going into earlier or different years, basically, in the layer?
This is actually one layer.
Yeah.
And so we expose that one single layer as a giant bed. Yeah. And it's all kinds of different species of fish.
Okay.
So there may be 10 to 15 species of fish coming out of this layer. None of them horribly, novel, for that time period.
Right.
And so we were finding lots of fish and lots of different species of fish, but nothing like Tiktaalik, nothing at that part of the tree of life, you know.
But they're all from the same period,
Yep.
basically. Okay. Now, in finding them and saying, oh, there's, you know, X, or oh, there's Y, that propels you forward because it's telling you that the question mark may be somewhere there.
Yeah, exactly. And then when we, once we know what Tiktaalik looks like, and that, you know, that gives you confidence that when you go somewhere else, your eye will be a little more trained to find it if it's there. And then we have it from a couple other sites as well. And
now, how did you know what Tiktaalik would look like? Or you hypothesized it? Yeah.
Basically, if you look at the transition from a lobe-finned fish to an early limbed animal, you know, you'll see, you know, you go from a creature with a conical head with eyes on either side in the lobe-finned fish. These early limbed animals have a flat head sort of thing with eyes on top. There are other changes as well. So we knew if we had a flat-headed fish with scales, it was going to be really interesting. And that's exactly what we saw for the first time, and that's when we knew we had Tiktaalik, when we saw a flat-headed fish.
And how did, can you talk about that moment when you saw him and what were your feelings?
Well, they're really beautiful, and we discovered several of them on the 4th day of that season that we almost decided not to go on. My colleague Steve Gates, who's a professor at Brown, was working with us that year, and we were working in Jason's site, cracking rocks, and Steve said, "Hey guys, what's this?" And we also ran up, and head of a flat-headed fish just sticking right out of the side of the hill. You know, at that moment, we knew it was exactly what we were looking for. We didn't know how much of the skeleton would be there, but we knew it was the exact creature. It was really, I mean, that moment was remarkable because it took us 6 years to get to that point. 6 years of blood, sweat, and tears in the Arctic. You know, you know, it's hard working there, both personally and physically and financially, you know, you name it. And so everybody who was involved with the project from the start, who saw it at that point, it was a huge moment for us. Then there was that moment went to panic, however, because getting the rock fossils out of the Arctic, particularly heavy things and big things like Tiktaalik, I mean, Tiktaalik, the biggest specimens are about 9 feet long, is no small matter. And our worry shifted not, you know, how we're going to find these things to how do we get them out of the rock and back home. Because that year we had really bad weather pretty much every day. It snowed or sleeted on us every day, and that it's not really conducive for you know, glue working on things or plasters and the traditional methods we use.
So is the idea that you take the whole area around the fish out,
wrap it in plaster, and then back it comes.
And transport it, and is that also a concern, I guess?
Yeah, it goes underneath the helicopter, and so that's what it has to be, you know. It goes a long way in a sling underneath the helicopter, or sometimes in the bed of a helicopter in the back seat, but nestled in seat belts, and, you know. And it's a long helicopter ride, and bumpy, and so forth.
So you had one.
No, that first year we had 1, 2, 3, 4.
But on this spotting, in this sighting,
that day,
so you were able to take several back with you.
And the next day we found another one, and about 3 days later we found yet another one. It was like boom, 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 really rapid. And it just was unbelievable. That week was just incredible because we knew we had wonderful material.
Right. At the site, are you carving him out of the rock, or are you carving the rock and taking the whole Megillah?
Taking the whole Megillah home. We don't carve him out of the rock there. You know, that is in the laboratory, done under very controlled circumstances. You know, we're basically bringing a big boulder home with bones sticking out of it. And we just leave it. If the bone is showing, we've already done too much, you know? And so we just try to sort of lightly work around it, leaving a safety margin. And you don't always get it right. Sometimes you do crack a piece of bone and so forth. But that's okay. And then, you know, you rough it out, and back it comes to the laboratory. It takes about a month and a half to get home.
Now, I want to understand how this discovery confirmed everything that you knew about where to look and the kind of rock. So this kind of rock was one that was such that the skeleton would be partially visible?
These rocks were formed in an ancient delta system at the margins or the bank of an ancient stream, or a point bar, or some area that would collect the skeletons as they washed down the stream in a flooding event or something like that, and they were rapidly buried. That's a classic fossil environment for preserving really nice bones. So it was clearly in an ancient river, or in the margin of an ancient river. And this geology was perfect for that, to find lots of fossil. And there are other species that are coming out of those rocks.
Now, how did Tiktaalik get his name?
Well, what happened?
Or her name, I guess. Well,
I have no idea. His, her, whatever. I don't know. When we found this creature, in the scientific paper, it's our job to give it a name, a generic and a specific name. And we wanted the name to be meaningful to the Inuit community. There was an Inuit community about 200 miles away that was giving us permits to work up there. We involved some of their youth in our field expeditions at the time. And we felt pretty connected to them. And we wanted them to feel involved in the project and in our work and so forth. So we worked with the Inuit traditional knowledge elders, and we talked to them to come up with a name that is meaningful to them and to us, and a name that we could pronounce. Now, Inuktitut is a very difficult language on the English-speaking tongue. And so that was not easy. Those two parameters weren't always easy. And so Tiktaalik is their word for a kind of large freshwater fish. And the name stuck. And then the species name is Rosea.
So you take the Tiktaalik back to the laboratory, and what do you find? Help us understand why this was such an important discovery that made the cover of the front page of the New York Times.
Right. So I wasn't the first person to see the beautiful material. Neither was Ted or any of the other senior scientists on the project. It was the fossil preparators. They're the talented people who literally sit with a needle in a pin vise under a microscope, removing the rock grain by grain. Now they can do this because the bone is harder than the rock, because the bone's kind of petrified. So there's a separation between the two. And so they use like little mini dental tools and pins and so forth over months. So we brought these things back, and Fred Mullison in Philadelphia, Bob Masick in Chicago, worked for months removing the rock from the bone.
Are these different fish that they're working on, or
different Tiktaalik specimens?
Yeah.
So we have a dinosaur lab in Chicago that's really big, so we had the big specimens of Tiktaalik in Chicago. There's a smaller lab in Philadelphia. They're specialized for smaller stuff, and so Fred was working on the material there. And over a period of months, Tiktaalik gradually revealed itself. First we saw the flat head with the eyes on top. Then we saw that Tiktaalik has a neck. Then we saw the body with scales on its back and fins with fin webbing. Then Bob took apart one of the fins, took the fin webbing off, and in it we found bones that correspond to shoulder, elbow, and wrist. That's over a period of 5, 6, 7 months, this creature started revealing itself as sort of a mosaic between fish and land-living limbed animal. If I was to hold it in front of you right now, what you'd see is a creature about 4 feet long, of the sort of one of the smaller specimens. And you'd look at it, and you'd see it has scales on its back and fins with fin webbing. You'd say, fish. Until you looked at the head, you'd see it has a crocodile-like, almost flat head with eyes on top. Has a neck. No fish has a neck. And then you'd see those limb bones that start to look awfully limb-like. Has big fat ribs. So it has this sort of mix between the characteristics of the land-living animals and fish. Found at just the right time in the fossil record, in around 375 million years ago, when we would expect this transition to be happening.
So this discovery, I want to go, I'm fascinated by the way in which all these things come together. So your training, your knowledge of geology tells you which rocks to look in and where to go, and you're bringing all your expertise to bear, but an undergraduate who happens to be on the team discovers the site.
Ain't that great?
And your perseverance says, oh, let's go back again at a time when you're debating whether to do that.
Exactly. And you bring a crew, each with different skills, and by the way, you have to cover a lot of turf up there.
Yeah.
So you need a bunch of people looking with different kinds of eyes and so forth. By the way, Jason Downs, who was the undergraduate when this was found, is now a postdoctoral fellow in paleontology. So he's stuck with it.
So he's doing well. Having started off on a high note, he decided to go on. So back to the fish. So he has a neck. He or she has a neck, and you can trace out the wrists, the ribs, in other parts, basically. And I guess you would say he's an athlete. He does a kind of push-up.
Yeah,
Tell us about that and why that's important.
Well, I mean,
I'm being facetious, I should tell you.
Sure. So Tiktaalik is an animal that could support itself on its fins.
Yeah.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
I mean, appendage support is pretty prominent. It could flex at the elbow, extend it sort of at the wrist area, the equivalent of the wrist. It has big pectoral muscles, so it could definitely sort of push itself up. For an animal that's supporting itself on its appendages, it's a good thing to have a neck. Fish don't have necks because if they want to move their eyes or mouth in space, they just swim around. They're moving in three-dimensional space. But the minute you become fixed to the ground or the substrate, all of a sudden, if you want to look around, the neck becomes very important. So the neck is tied to having a head mobility to move the head, eyes, and mouth while the creature's fixed on the ground. You know, and so you see this correlation among the origin of different features in Tiktaalik for the first time. It's really remarkable because you're seeing a creature that's specializing for life in the shallows. You know, it's still in water. Tiktaalik has both lungs and gills. You know, but it's able to support itself on the water bottom, in the shallows, and maybe for short periods in the mud flats and so forth.
Do you speculate as to why it needed to make this move and then adapted?
Yeah, so if you look at compare water to land at this time period, water is loaded with predators, loaded with competitors. It's pretty, fish eat fish world in these streams that we find Tiktaalik in. It's living with some 10, 15 feet long fish that are big and nasty. On land, you have some of the earliest forests. You have large arthropods and vertebrates, but no competitors for Tiktaalik and its descendants. So, you compare and contrast. Land is actually free of competitors, free of predators, as opposed to water. So there may be some influence of getting away from the fight, if you will, the hostile environment, onto land, onto rich food sources which exist on land as well. There's another kind of explanation which I'm not really, these are not mutually exclusive. That is the notion that perhaps rising oxygen levels towards the end of the Devonian and later had something to do with the creatures evolving on land and evolving sort of more of a reliance on air breathing.
How long did it take for this fish to become what it was, do you think, in relation to its ancestor that had not yet become distinctively what Tiktaalik was?
Oh, I'd say you're probably looking at about 7 million years, and then probably another 7 to 10 million years before you get real creatures with real fingers and things like that are real limbed animals. So it's a pretty long period of time, actually. It didn't happen fast, at least according to the data we have now.
Now, we've in talking about this discovery, you've helped us understand how this you're working across disciplines and how all these disciplines are informing where you go, what you see, what you find, and the conclusions you reach. In your book, The Inner Fish, you also talk about breakthroughs in genetics and our understanding of DNA that essentially allows people like you doing this kind of work to see our relation to living animals, to come to an understanding of how they come to be what they are, and their relation to us on the one hand, but also some of the same mechanisms may have been at work in this prehistory. Talk a little about that.
Sure, you can put it really simply and ask the question, look at the genetic and developmental recipe that builds the body of a land-living animal, like an amphibian, and look at the genetic and developmental recipe that builds the body of a fish. And then you can ask the simple question to compare. What's the difference between those two recipes, or among many more recipes? To get to the notion is, what are the differences, the genetic differences, between sort of the genetic recipe that builds a limb from a fin? Are they major? Are they minor? Do you have to evolve whole new sets of genes to have a limb come on board? And so that's sort of the motivation that when you get to the understanding living creatures and their genetics and development and so forth. When you look at this in more detail, and you look at the genetic sort of toolkit that builds an appendage, whether it's a limb or a fin, they're largely similar. And what that's suggesting in a very powerful way is that much of the machinery that builds the skeleton of a limb is already present in the fin of a fish. Sharks, teleost fish, things like trout and salmon and that sorts of things. And they're distant relatives. They all have the central toolkit that builds a limb in place. Now, there are subtle differences between them, but they're not huge differences between them. So that's sort of the take-home message we're seeing. Now we're trying to get to say, well, what are these subtle differences, and how did fingers arise from the sort of the bones we call radials in a fish fin?
And you can look at genes in the genome in particular animals and essentially experiment in the lab with living animals to see how what triggers the different mechanisms to make the substantial changes.
Exactly, and we can manipulate the embryos, and we can look at what are the switches that turns those genes on and off, how are those switches, how do they compare between fish and a limbed animal, and we can ask all those questions with great power now on lots of different kinds of species. So it's really a great time to work on all these things.
And you're saying that the great evolutionary transformation did not involve new DNA. It's really something getting turned on or off, and as a result, creating a new direction.
Yeah, it's basically using existing genes in new ways. Is sort of the idea, redeploying them at different times and places. And so, yeah, it didn't involve necessarily a great genetic revolution. It's using existing materials. And when you think about that, and that this transformation in the fossil record happened over tens of millions of years, and the fact that likely the genetic toolkit that makes the bodies of limbed animals is already present in large state in fish, this transition becomes easy to happen. And the question becomes, why didn't it happen a zillion times? Why did it only happen once?
And sometimes this doesn't work in the sense that we humans wind up with products of evolution that we could do without. You use the example of hiccups and hernias.
Hernias are a great one, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to look at a human male, I mean, it makes no sense, and it's probably nobody's surprised that it makes the least sense in the genital area, because the way the spermatic cord, connects the testes, or the vas deferens inside the spermatic cord, connect the testes to the penis, is this bizarre loop that's taken, and it takes a bizarre course. It doesn't go to a direct route from scrotum to penis. It goes up and around the bowl of the pelvis and down through the whole of the pelvis, if you will. And it's that loop and the formation of that loop that causes human males problems. They're more susceptible to certain kinds of hernias than females. And the reason for that is we begin our development like a fish, with the gonads, the primordia for the gonads, up here towards the kidneys and the chest, and they descend over time towards the scrotum. In the females, the ovaries descend as well, but just not as far, because they don't lie sort of in an out pocket of the body wall. And it's that formation and the descent of the testes which creates a weakness in the male body wall. And so you can have hernias that develop during the development of that descent of the testes in infants, or you can have it in adults where there's a weakness of the body wall, and portions of the gut cavity get pushed through.
You write in your book that great ideas begin with simple premises, and one simple idea that you're saying is driving your work is that all of us are modified descendants of our parents, and that brings a clarity to how all of this that we've been talking about happens.
Yeah, and that's Charles Darwin. One of the main ideas in Charles Darwin's Origin of Species is descent with modification. That is, we're all modified descendants of our parents, and we have a family tree in our own families. But our family tree extends to other species. And our species is a modified descendant of the ancestral species that we've come from. And if you look at the world in a pattern of descent with modification, you see the world in the form of an evolutionary tree, where features can be traced over millions and billions of years to their ancestors.
Now, what is one left with when one realizes this? Obviously, it's a wonderful insight, but how has it affected your thinking about humanity's place in the universe that we live in?
I mean, it's impossible not to see this and not to feel and experience in a powerful way the deep connection we have to the rest of life on our planet. I mean, in our genes and our bodies and everything. I mean, this is sort of written in the Nobel Prizes in medicine or physiology. I mean, if you look at the Nobel Prizes in medicine or physiology the last, 17 years, who have they gone to? Well, they've gone to people working on flies, people working on worms, people working on sea urchins, yeasts, sea slugs, corn. And all these are, work on other creatures to provide insights about human health. So I like to think if as we discover, cures or treatments for things that ail us, like Alzheimer's and various types of cancers, those treatments or cures will ultimately be derived from work originally done on flies and worms and yeast and sea urchins. I mean, can you imagine a more powerful way to state our deep connection to the rest of life on our planet than that? And that's all because of the evolutionary tree. The descent with modification that Darwin was talking about.
Now, how do you think that the man's power over technology will affect our evolution? I mean, are we going to see unbelievable changes where, in a sense, we are impacting these processes that you've discovered in faraway times?
Well, we already are. I mean, our culture, our society, social structure, the gizmos and technologies we devise, whether it's our medicines or machines that enhance our performance, our lives, that affect the way we see the world and interact and behave and so forth. Those kinds of structures are very much going to influence our future in a great way, much more than our genes, right? I mean, that doesn't say that our genetic evolution isn't happening and continually happening and it's not important. Just look at the threats of infectious disease that we face. We're at a continual war with microbes. But sometimes that we're able to mediate that with our medications. But so we're at a Darwinian level, we're still evolving, very much so, and we're still at war, if you will, with the bugs that are around us. And not always at war, we're in a symbiotic relationship with many of them as well. But our technologies are going to influence our performance, and already are, in so many ways. Look at doping scandals in bicycling and baseball. Look at the technologies that can enhance human memory and muscle mass and, all basic parameters of what we are, So, you come back in 500 years, I mean, human performance will be driven largely, I think, by social structures and technologies that enhance them.
Does these discoveries and these fields that you work in what way do they interface with the global warming problem, if at all? I mean, is it just that we get a sense of how it all sort of fits together and that at a certain point man has to draw a line as to what it wants to do in certain directions, lest it harm the environment?
Well, in the fossil record, we see the influence of global warming. We see the influence of global change in general on faunas and floras and extinctions and so forth. I mean, there's a finely tuned balance between changes in the climate and the atmosphere and the kinds of life and their distribution on our planet. What's challenging here is the rate of change is not something we've been able to measure in the kind of fossil record that I work on easily. And so it doesn't lend us a predictive power to the kinds of challenges we're going to face as a society as a result of our own activities now.
Looking at reflecting on your career now, how would you advise students who are interested in this stuff to prepare for the future? I mean, obviously develop skills in a lot of disciplines, you seem to be saying.
Yeah, but it starts with the liberal arts. It really does. I mean, a good liberal arts education can't be beat. You need it. It's an essential. Reading, writing, the classics, literature, history, science. I mean, just liberal education is the centerpiece for all of this because that provides the grounding for your curiosity. Having a background that's sophisticated enough so that you know where to look when you have a question becomes so important. And not having fear, to admit ignorance and ask a colleague and go into a new field. I always encourage students to be aggressive with their professors and their teachers and to say, oh, I'm interested in this stuff. What do I need to know? How do I do it? And they'll often be your best advisors.
How do you think that, let's go back to your medical school class, because how do you think you, with this background, have informed them and essentially in some way impacted their educational experience and then the way they think about the human body as a result of the broader perspective that you bring to anatomy?
Well, I like to think that, you know, at best, my aspiration, let's put it that way, is that they look at the human body in a different way. Now, they are in medical school for a particular reason. They need to know the structures of the body, and they need to have that toolkit. But along with that, I'd also love for them to have an appreciation of how important understanding our connections to the rest of life on our planet are to understanding the human body. And I know for some medical students that's been very important. They've emailed me and we've talked about it, and you know, everybody's different, but at least my aspiration is absolutely that knowing the connections we have with the rest of life on our planet not only tells us about the structures of our body, but the ways our bodies are unintelligently designed and may fall apart from time to time.
Well, on that note, Neil, I want to thank you very much for being here. Let me show your book, Your Inner Fish, which is a fascinating read for young and old, and it really gives a sense of what your field is up to and the remarkable discoveries that you and your team have made. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.